The sampling technique is one of the most helpful techniques for researchers to collect data from possible respondents for their study. Limited resources is the usual problem in research, and the sampling technique can be the solution for that, because it allows the researcher to gather data that can make the research reliable, which can lead to meaningful research finding. The different types of sampling techniques are simple random sampling, stratified sampling, cluster sampling, systematic sampling, convenience sampling, volunteer sampling, snowball sampling, and kata sampling.
Simple random sampling is a fundamental technique in which each member of a population has an equal chance of being selected. The process involves defining the population, determining the sample size, assigning numbers to individuals, generating random numbers, and selecting the samples accordingly. Its primary objectives include unbiased selection and enabling statistical inference. Advantages include simplicity, unbiased, and representation, while disadvantages encompasses the need for a complete population list, time and cost considerations, and impractically for large population. Consideration for its use include population size, the availability of a sampling frame, and the need for a truly random sampling method to ensure the validity and reliability of results.
Example: a restaurant leaves a fishbowl on the counter for diners to drop their business cards. Once a month, a business card is pulled out to award one lucky diner with a free meal.
Stratified sampling is a technique used in statistics to ensure that the sample accurately represents the population by dividing the population into homogeneous subgroups, called strata, and the selecting samples from each stratum. The advantage of using this technique is that it can reduce the risk of being biased and increase the precision of estimate for each subgroup. However, the disadvantage of using the technique is that it requires detailed knowledge of the population's characteristic and may require larger sample size compared to smaller sampling. For example, if you are conducting research on high school students, you must first identify each student grade and section, then divide the student into strata. Determine the sample size for each stratum, and randomly select samples from each section and grade. And finally, combine the samples from each department to form your overall sample for the survey.
Cluster sampling is used in large studies. The concept of this sampling technique is a whole population that is divided into clusters that are similar to each other but different from other clusters, and randomly choose a representative from each cluster. The primary purpose and objective are to make it easier for the researcher to get sample from a large group. The advantages of cluster sampling are that it is more time efficient because researchers do not need to survey all the population in a cluster. They will just take a few people to represent the whole population, and if the cluster choose a person who can really represent the whole population, it can lead to a greater outcome. The disadvantage are if no one in the cluster wants to represent the whole population, and if the chosen representative did not answer the survey accurately. For example, the researchers will take one representative from each of the 6 strands in the senior high school department to represent the whole population in their strand.
Systematic sampling is a type of probability sampling that selects items of data at irregular intervals from a population. The purpose of systematic sampling is a statistical method used to select a sample from a larger population, systematically and randomly. It is a widespread technique for researchers and analysts who want to gather data from a large population without surveying every individual. Here are the advantages of a systematic sampling. It's straightforward and easy to implement. It ensures equal representation of the entire population, and it's more efficient than simple random sampling. For large populations, the disadvantages of systematic sampling are it may introduce bias if there is a pattern in the population, it's sensitive to periodicity in the population, and it may not be suitable for population with a natural order or sequence. The considerations are ensuring that the sampling interval is appropriate for the population size, being aware of any potential patterns or periodicities in the population, and considering using random sampling points to minimize bias.
For example, in systematic random sampling, researchers choose a sampling interval k and randomly select a number between 1 and 3, starting with 2. They then select every third element from the starting point until the desired sample size is reached. They would select the second, fifth, and eighth elements from the population to form a systematic random sample.
Convenience sampling, a non-probability sampling technique that includes researchers gathering respondents whom is the easiest to reach. This is an efficient way to gather up data since it's a low-cost way of gathering data. Though be warned about the disadvantages of convenience sampling since it can be biased. That's because people or a certain portion of a population may get overrepresented or underrepresented. Though you can still mind that it being time efficient is a big advantage, especially if the researchers is rushed. Imagine we have a group of researchers finding and gathering up data for their research. Unfortunately, a section already left for home. They have two options: wait for the students tomorrow or look for students left and still in the building. Inconvenience something, they will choose this to opt for the students in the certain section who is still left in the building to gather up their data.
Volunteer sampling is a technique in which individuals freely express their thoughts and life experiences, because only those who are interested in participating will do so. It's similar to having a conversation. These volunteers willingly add their thoughts, viewpoints, and anecdotes to the research, giving it more depth. Recruiting a great deal of potential respondents easily and inexpensively can be accomplished using voluntary sampling, particularly if you have access to an expansive community or platform. However, there are certain disadvantages to voluntary sampling as well, including inadequate response rates, limited adaptability, and bias related to self-selection.
Let's have an example. A business company decided to do a research about the feedbacks from their customers. They will ask their customers for their feedbacks, and only the customers who's willing to share their opinions will be a sample to help them gather the information they're looking for.
Snowball sampling is non-probabilistic sampling technique used qualitative research. It involves identifying initial participant who met specific criteria and then asking them to refer to others who also meet the criteria. This process continues with the new participant referring the additional participant, creating a snowball effect. It's often used when population being studied is hard to reach to identify the advantages are that useful reaching population that are difficult to access like marginalized or the hidden communities. It's often less expensive than other sampling methods since they relies on the exciting connection within the community, while the disadvantage are that it can lead the bias result because it relies on exciting social network, potentially including the certain group. A limited representative sample may not accurately represent the population since it depends to initial contact.
What's up everyone? This is an example of snowball sampling. If you don't know what is snowball sampling, this is an example. and listen carefully. The snowball sampling is a research method used to study a population that is hard to reach. First step, the researcher will ask a respondent. Then, the respondent will be recommend someone to the researcher to answer his or her survey questionnaire. And the researcher will look for respondent who will spread the survey questionnaire.
Data sampling is a method used in research to gather a representative sample of a population. The process involved dividing the population into subgroups or strata based on certain characteristics like age, gender, income, or education level. Quotas are then set for each subgroup based on their proportion the population. The goal of quota sampling is to ensure the final sample reflects the demographic composition of the population being studied, even though it doesn't guarantee randomness in participant selection. And the purpose and objective of quota sampling revolve among obtaining a sample that accurately reflect the population demographics, thereby enabling researchers draw conclusions and make informed decisions based on their findings. The advantage of it are that is a cheaper as fewer responded are required, while the disadvantage is that is harder to eliminate bias in the selection process.
For example, a grade 8 population has 150 students. Then we will divide it into two, and it will be 75 male and female. But the researcher only need 10 respondents, so they will get 5 students from male and female.
Sampling technique and statistics are crucial for ensuring representativeness and reliability of research findings. Simple random sampling, stratified sampling, cluster sampling, systematic sampling, convenience sampling, voluntary sampling, snowball sampling, and quota sampling each offer unique advantage and disadvantage. Simple random sampling provides unbiased representation and general stability, but requires a complete population list and may be impractical for large populations. Stratified sampling increases precision by dividing the population into homogeneous subgroups, but demands detailed knowledge of population characteristics and potentially large sample size. Cluster sampling streamlines data collection for large studies, but can suffer if chosen representatives do not accurately reflect the population. Systematic sampling is straightforward and efficient for large population but may introduce bias if a pattern exists in the population. Convenience sampling is efficient but prone to bias due to over or underrepresentation. Volunteer sampling leverage willing participants for depth but suffer from limited adaptability and potential self-selection bias. Snowball sampling access hard-to-reach population but may yield biased results and limited representativeness. Quota sampling ensure demographic representation but lack randomness in participant selection, potentially leading to biased conclusion. In conclusion, selecting the appropriate sampling technique depends on various factors including population size, research objective, resource, availability, and the need for representativeness. Researchers must carefully consider these factors to maximize the validity and reliability of their study.